Well, kick those tires and start that fake fire. Today, I am so excited. I know I say that all the time, and I'm generally excited, more excited than the Pointer Sisters, and anyone old enough to get that reference. However, today I welcome someone. I get to interview a lot of authors, but it's rare that I get to interview an author whose books have actually changed how I work and cost me lots of money and time because they showed me the error of my ways while inspiring me. So, you could not script a better conversation than we are going to have with the legendary author, master of story, master of genre. He is like Avatar, the last genre bender. Please welcome Jon Truby to our virtual campfire. Jon, thank you so much for carving time out of breaking the literature mold to be with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. I love talking about story.
I mean, who wouldn't, right? I meant to ask you earlier in our conversation, Jon, do you have kids?
I have two stepdaughters.
So I'm always curious, like, if I had a parent who was the master of story and genre, is that just are you going through any stories that are brought to you, I wonder, in writing? I feel like you would take my Christmas cards and point out the flaws in my design principle in my writing. I just can't imagine what family members would be like to have the resource of Jon Truby in their family for story consulting.
You find out if you're somebody who has a reputation for understanding writing, the one thing that your daughters do not want to come to you for is insights about writing. They want to do it themselves, but occasionally they will come to me for advice in that area. But they're both very successful at that, and so it's never been something that came up.
Oh man. Well, obviously, you are a legend in the industry, and you have just so much insight. And I tell everyone this. I mean, there's a few books that get mentioned. Yours is always at the top of this. But for anyone who is not into writing, and one thing I really appreciate about your book too is I don't think you need to be just in. I think a lot of it gets caught up in screenwriting or entertainment. But the thing I love about your books is it's just so applicable and helping people guide through what a story needs to have and the homework you invite us to do before going down that journey. So I guess I would like to start sort of your origin story, which you do cover in the book a little bit, but how does one become this sort of sage of story? And walk us through how you actually get to this place.
It is an interesting story because when I started so long ago, this was before they had all of these books on how to write a script, on how to write a story. And so I had to be self-taught. And I figured the way to do it is to see as many movies as I can. And so I was working and living near the Carnegie Hall Cinema, Art House Cinema. And I got a job there, and which allowed me, and they would play two classic films every day, two new classic films every day. So when I wasn't doing my job, I got to sit in the theater and watch these films, and I took notes. And I broke down these films, and what I was looking for was what works and what doesn't work, and why does it work? And I found that about 90% of what worked was in the deep structure of the story, way below the surface. And so I started seeing a number of these techniques and patterns and started to apply it to my own writing. And at the same time, I started helping friends who were writers try to improve their scripts. And very quickly, Hollywood is a small town, so very quickly my reputation got around, and I started doing a great deal of story consulting work. And I've now done story consulting for every major studio. And at some point, I decided I need to take these techniques and create a class so I can get these techniques out there, because at that point, the only thing that was being taught was this classic 3-act structure. And I felt that while 3-act structure is fine for beginners, it in no way prepares a writer to write at the professional level. And that's what I was interested in, and that's what all my friends were interested in. So I decided to put together a course that had all the professional techniques, what I thought were all the professional techniques that a writer would need to break into that very rare level of writer. And that course became extremely successful very quickly. And a few years later, I decided to turn that into a book. And it was The Anatomy of Story. I think the important thing for writers to understand is that three-act structure is imposed from the outside. There are no act breaks in a story. This is completely fabricated, and it was created by a script analyst who was trying to, after the fact, see if he could see some patterns. So he used the simplest pattern there is. Break it into 3 parts. You can break anything into 3 parts. The question is, does it help you do anything? And I found that the advice that this 3-act structure method was giving writers could not work. And yet it gave them the impression that it would, which is why I consider 3-act structure to be one of the most harmful things that has ever happened to screenwriters. Because it makes you think it's basically a magic bullet. And the information that it's giving you as a writer is so simplistic that there's no possible way that you can break into that high level of writer that works at the professional level. And this is the main thing that I have tried to get across to writers, especially over the last few years, which is your goal as a storyteller, if you want to be a professional, is to certainly to sell your work, but more specifically to create your unique story brand, because that's what sets you apart from everybody else trying to do that. Because the industry will pay big money only to someone that they can only get from that person. If they can get it from everybody else, why would they pay you? So you've got to create that unique story brand. So the question is, what is that unique story brand? How do you do that? And I found that means you've got to be in the top 1% of writers. Why? Because the top 1% of writers sells 90% of the product.
That's right. And then Taylor Sheridan makes up the other 10%, right? Of all the, I am marvel at all the shows he has. When you said like you're distinct, I go, how does a man just write between Landman and 1923 and 1918 and Yellowstone? I'm just blown away. And so we see an example of someone who's like, hey, you want outlaw Western action? Like this is my style, right? And he created his own thing.
That's his brand. And that's why he has paid an enormous sum of money for all of that. And that's what all of us as writers are trying to do. And so the question then became, what separates that 1% from everybody else? What's the distinguishing feature? And when I finally realized what it was, it shocked me, because it turns out it's the ability to construct complex plot. Now, plot is the most difficult thing for writers to get, and it is the most difficult thing to teach. And most writers, they say they start with either 3-act structure, or maybe they've read Hero's Journey or Save the Cat, and they think, oh, I know all about story. But in fact, if you look at those books, and they're fine for beginners, but if you look at those books, you find there are almost no practical story techniques there. And certainly nothing that can allow you to write at the professional level. So the challenge is, how do you master plot? And there's where the problem is, because plot is the most underestimated of all the major writing skills. There are more techniques that go into plot than all of the other major writing skills combined. And the problem is made even worse by the fact that people who don't know plot don't know that they don't know plot. And so here's what they do. They start to write their story, and they figure, I don't really know what is going to happen next. I'll just figure it out as I go. And guess what? That never happens, because plot is an entire construct, an entire scheme that you have got to figure out before the hero does action one. And this is the biggest obstacle to writers up front. They have no idea that they have to figure out this very complex sequence of actions that the hero is going to take to deal with the opponent who is taking a sequence of actions against the hero, all of that has to be figured out up front. It's a grand strategy. And so writers who think, I'll just figure it out as I go, pantsers and so on, they have zero chance of getting into that 1%.
So do you think when we hear about writers who seemingly say, oh, I just kind of sit down. I remember Randall Wallace gave a talk one time and he said, I didn't know what was going to happen at the end until I wrote it. And I said, well, I could see you still probably had a lot figured out, but even writers who seem to communicate that their writing is like they're learning as they go and they're surprised by their ending, do you think that that's probably more explainable? The fact is there still was an enormous amount of thought and just processing. I heard Jordan Peele say in an interview that, he was noodling for years on Get Out. Like it was just simmering. And, do you think that that's when people say that they just kind of wrote it, that's actually probably not accurate? Like there was some level of real like simmering that was happening before they
totally. And especially when you hear it from a professional, Randall Wallace, I'm sorry, the author. Jordan Peele, right. These are people who have tremendous number of techniques, professional techniques, that are so embedded in their mind that if you say, what specific technique was that? They may not know, but that doesn't mean it's not in there. And also, this thing of, I figured it out as I go. And when I got to the end I figured out the ending. That's total nonsense. And let's assume for a second for that one person, it was done that way. It worked that way. To me, it's very much like the analogy of Mozart, where Mozart could just, with Salieri would say, it's so maddening that this guy can just sit down and come up with this fantastic work of music without doing any craft to it at all. Okay, if you're Mozart, you can do that too.
Great.
If you're Stephen King, you can do that too. But how many of us are Stephen King? No, to me, one of the first principles of great storytelling, you have to know the end point because that's the target. You have to know, now that doesn't mean you know every specific of that end point, but you have to know the general end point because every scene in the story must eventually lead to that point. Something I always talk about in the Anatomy of Story is that every story is a journey of learning that the hero goes on. They may also go on a physical journey. If it's a myth story, it will also be a physical journey. But regardless of the genre, there was always a journey of learning that the character is going through. In any journey, before you can take step one, you have to know the final spot that you're going to. Otherwise, you're going to walk around in circles. The only way that you can have this necessary sequence of actions, which, by the way, are in response to the actions of the opponent, the only way you can make that get to that endpoint in the tight form that it's required for great storytelling is to know what that endpoint is up front.
I don't know how Stephen King does it. When I hear about he writes every day. I remember that he's like, so at least he puts in his 3 hours. But, and James Patterson gave a great note. He's like, I'll give you my best advice for being a writer. Write.
Sure.
A lot of people don't even bother to do that. So when we talk about this sort of lack of figuring out this plot, practically, how should that manifest for those of us who are just like borderline Mozart, just like a step underneath? Is that doing the homework where we're so excited to get down and write that we just kind of in our enthusiasm don't do the stuff of actually working it out, plotting it out, mapping it out? How does that manifest practically?
Oh, it has to do with absolutely mapping it out. And here's another misconception a lot of writers have. They think mapping it out has to do with a scene outline. That's certainly an important part of it, no question about it, because the scene sequence is the final architecture and the most detailed architecture of the story before you actually dive into the scenes. Once you've dived into the scenes, you're in the forest. You can't see, you're in amongst the trees. You can't see the overall forest. So that scene list, that scene sequence is absolutely crucial. I consider it the single most important step in the entire writing process. But that is only a small part of the preparation that goes into creating a great plot. And the part of the thing has to do with There's a lot of techniques that go into great plot. I consider the single most important technique, and it's really a series of techniques in plotting, is great plot comes from character. And that means, among other things, that you have to establish the great weakness of your hero first, and the plot then is a solution to that weakness. Now, this is something that, again, writers often misunderstand. They think that the plot is the hero going after his goal. And that's certainly what it appears to be to the reader and to most writers. In fact, the plot is really a solution to the internal flaw that going after the goal will force the hero to deal with. It's only by going after that goal that the hero runs up against an opponent, and the attacks by the opponent are what get the hero to have to deal with the deep flaw that the whole story started with. The first step before you can come up with a plot and before you come up with an endpoint for that goal is, what is the internal flaw, the character, the psychological and or the moral weakness that the hero has that's ruining their life? Because that's what the audience really cares about, to see that's what they really want to see solved. Now, once you have that weakness figured out, then you come up with that specific goal. And here's another place where writers have a big problem. They don't come up with a specific goal. That goal has got to be highly specific, because that is going to be the track that the story rides down. Without a specific endpoint, and by specific I mean we have to be clear that the audience will know whether the hero succeeded in getting the goal or not. There's got to be a moment at the end of the story when it's very clear the hero got it or they failed. Now, most of the time they get it, but not always. And that's not the really important point. The important point is, give the hero a specific goal, have them go down that track. If they get the goal, great. If not, that's still fine, as long as they solve the internal weakness that the whole story is really about.
And the solving could also be, because obviously you reference The Godfather so much in some of your writing, but correct me if I'm wrong here, but for example, when we see, and if you haven't seen it by now, folks, it's on you, but when we see the door shut, when Michael lies to Kay at the end of the first one, when she asks if you killed Carlo, and he says no. And then we look up at the end and we see them kiss his hand, and that just chilling scene where the door shuts on her. Is that an example of like, okay, it's been the moral dilemma is now solved. Michael is now a Sith Lord essentially, and has turned to the dark side. Is that kind of a practical example of what we're talking about?
It's an excellent practical example. The problem is that it is so unique in the way it solves that problem that writers often take the wrong lesson from it. Because here's the thing. At the end of the story is usually when the hero gets a self-revelation. It's one of the 7 major structure steps. You start off with a weakness need. Self-revelation is at the end, and that's where the hero overcomes the weakness need. Now, in The Godfather, the end of Godfather 1, we see, instead of a moral success, instead of the hero having a self-revelation, oh, here's how I have been wrong up until now, here's how I have to change my life for the better. Instead, we have a rare example of the hero falling morally. Even though he's become more successful and more powerful, internally, morally, he's become the devil. So this is why the self-revelation, we don't always solve the problem. If the character fails to solve the problem, they decline. And then that's one of the marks of a tragedy. But one of the beauties of the way they wrote Godfather 1 is that they deprived Michael of getting this self-revelation. But it wasn't because they just forgot that's an important step that you got to have in the story. No, they give it to Kay, which means they give it to the audience. Because they realize, oh my God, he should have had this self-revelation, but he doesn't. He's fallen. He's become a liar as well as a mass murderer. And that this guy who started off this story as a relatively good guy ends up more of a devil than even his father was.
It's a chilling scene. It's this one time you can ask me about my business. Oh,
Yep.
so it's so, Yeah, it's so good. I did want to ask you about just on the three act structure, coming back to that, is part of the problem there too is humans, we tend to just view everything as beginning, middle, and end, like from a time constraint. I mean, we just think of things in that way. So just to play a little, devil's advocate there, do we, I know you mentioned it was imposed externally, but don't we sort of filter stories that way through our own kind of lens and we kind of internally feel that like, hey, by this point, especially in a movie, which tends to be what, an hour and 38 minutes or whatever it is, right? Our audience is bringing an expectation to where we go, oh, by a certain point, or whether it's a book, it's like halfway through the book or whatever, like we kind of know where in the story we think we should be. I'm curious if that affects any of that.
I don't believe so. I believe that three-act structure comes from theater, where we literally open and close a curtain. So it's sections. These are three sections. But there is no inherent reason why any story should have three sections. For example, Shakespeare always divided his play into five. Now, there's no inherent reason why you have to divide something into five. It's just more detailed than three is. The reason that three-act structure came about was because three is the simplest number required for a process. And every story tracks a process of the hero's change.
Beginning, middle, and end, essentially.
That's right. And the funny part to me is that three-act structure is trying to put some technical terms to what is essentially beginning, middle, and end, right? Oh, that we're in our second act now. No, now we're in the third act. What does it matter? It doesn't matter. It's the question for the writer is, what are the specific technical tools, story tools you need to make that story work through that process and tell a great story about a great character? And my contention is that three-act structure, it's better than somebody who's just starting with nothing. Right?
When you say stories fail, and obviously, so for for those of us who are just watching something the first time, a fail might be like, why did that story, maybe it feels like a lot of the streaming movies that come out that seem so disposable and you go, it didn't really affect me. And obviously there's a lot of variables, a great performance, a cool premise. But when you say a story fails, just 80-20, what does that generally mean? Does that mean a lack of like conflict? Or if I came to you and said, this movie is I don't get it, it's failing for me, how would you help me articulate what is wrong with it in most of the stuff you see today?
That's part of the reason I wrote 2 books on it. It's very complicated and stories fail for many different reasons. As I said, what distinguishes the top 1% of stories from everybody else writing stories is in the plot area. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that stories that, quote, fail don't fail for character reasons. For example, the character setup may be wrong. The opposition may be wrong. And that will really show up in the plot because the opponent is the key character, is the key story element for making a plot work. Most people think it's the hero going after their goal. That is certainly what is happening, but that's not the key to plot. The key to plot is the opponent.
Gotcha. Okay. So you would say maybe a couple things that you would see frequently are, okay, the antagonist is either not right for this opponent, doesn't bring out the right dilemma. Is it not enough? There's these milestones are met, so things are not being pushed forward. And I'm sure also, and we'll get into, there's different problems, I imagine, specific to each genre that would happen. But generally, just to kind of, I guess what I was getting at is that with general plot problems that you see today, so would you say it's a lot of times there's just not enough conflict, especially with the right antagonist that's like
Absolutely.
drawing our character for, or drawing our protagonist forward?
And the technical term that I use is punch, counter punch. What you're looking for in the middle of the story to get maximum plot and to get maximum narrative drive. And narrative drive is the one thing that studios, publishers, everybody is looking for. It is the most important element of popular story. Strong narrative drive, basically a page turner. The biggest reason something is not a page turner, after that thing we've already talked about, which is the lack of a specific goal that the hero is compelled to get. The second thing is lack of punch counter punch, which means We want, in a good plot, we want a heavyweight fight between two equally matched fighters. And in order to get maximum plot, you're going to have the opponent is going to hit first. They're going to hit the hero. The hero then is going to counterpunch. That leads to the opponent punching. Counterpunch, punch, counterpunch, punch, counterpunch. And we want as dense a punch counterpunch as we can get, and we want it to build in terms of intensity and conflict over the course of the story.
What makes a good punch? Is it like a targeted strike that hits the character, our hero, like right where he needs to be hit? Is it like a claw that reveals a little more? Maybe walk us through a little bit, like what makes a good punch?
Let's take a punch from the point of view of the opponent. Opponent hitting the hero. And again, that's the trick to plot. You've got to track all of those opponent punches first, because that's what is the overall scheme that the hero is trying to deal with. That's what's making it hard for them to win. So if you don't know what those opponent punches are, you've got zero chance to come up with a good plot. Now, there are two main ways, and they have to do with the first two structure steps of the 7 major structure steps that we've talked about. First one is weakness need. That's an internal flaw. B2 is the desire. This is where the hero comes up with his goal for the story. There are two ways that the opponent punches the hero. One is he punches his weakness. 2, he punches the goal. And this is how we determine who is a great opponent for that hero. Because a great opponent is somebody who is best able to attack the hero's great flaw. And he's the person who wants to prevent the hero from getting his goal, who is most intent on preventing the hero from getting his goal.
So if we could, maybe you referenced Star Wars a lot too, and I want to get into how that changed everything, but maybe, because on the surface, this might seem pretty simple, right? You have essentially an evil space wizard and a young cowboy, essentially, and it doesn't seem to be too advanced, like versus The Godfather, where these, there's a lot of morality and internal, versus a story like Star Wars, where it seems like, it's pretty much situational, like actual attack. You blew up my moisture farm.
Yep.
But could you walk us through maybe a little bit of like maybe some of the interactions in Star Wars, since I know everyone has like seen Star Wars, and how our opponents, might have some great punches that kind of move that plot along?
Star Wars is, of course, revolutionary for a lot of reasons. It really created the modern Hollywood of today. But one of the things, anytime you're trying to break down a story and how it works, you have to start with a genre. Now, as I talk about anatomy of genres, one of the reasons that Star Wars was revolutionary is because it was the first to really mix a lot of genres. Up until then, it was primarily, we're doing a detective story here. That's it. Or even 2 years earlier with Jaws. Jaws, that's a horror story. That's it. And you can be very successful just doing one genre. But what Hollywood learned when Star Wars came out was that when you mix genres, your ability to create a worldwide audience is exponential. And at the same time, they realized anytime you mix genres, you want to have a primary genre, the genre that the other genres are layered on top of. And Star Wars is a myth-based story. The primary genre is myth. This is the oldest, and to this day, the most popular genre there is. It is the base of more blockbusters than any other genre by far. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the particular culture of that character or that story. It has worldwide appeal. First of all, because it typically deals with archetypal characters. And second of all, because what the character is going after, their goal, and the journey that they go through is something that anyone, anywhere can understand. You contrast that with the form that travels least well around the world, which is comedy, because comedy is typically very culture-based and specifically to a subculture that made that story. So if we break down Star Wars, that first of all, it's primarily a myth story where the hero in a myth story, the hero goes on a physical journey and ends up back at home. Usually ends up back at home. And the great irony of the myth story is the hero has to go on a long physical journey to figure out what was already there. Because myth stories are about understanding, finding your true capabilities, and then realizing them, because that's how you create your own immortality in this world. It's the only way we really have immortality. And this is why myth is, as a story form, a religious story form. It's about how do you gain immortality. So we have this young guy who's very green. He's living in the middle of nowhere on this. I don't know how they grow anything there, because it's basically
Moisture farms, Tatooine. It's very desert. Climate change, really rough there.
But so that is all part of setting up his weakness need up front. And of course, we're going to find out, and this is a major part of the myth form, he is the chosen one. He is somebody who is not only destined to be a warrior, he is destined to save the nation. That's the technical story definition of an epic. The fate of the nation is determined by the actions of a single character. Luke goes on this journey, but of course, first of all, he has to get training. And this is what the Force is all about. One of the most popular aspects of Star Wars is this pseudo-religious element of the Force. But that's, in story terms, that's gaining the training he needs to become the warrior that he has to be to save the nation. And so then, as in all myth stories, he's going to go on a physical journey. And the way you get plot in a myth story is, unlike detective story, the way you get plot is you have the hero encounter a number of secondary opponents on the path. Each of these creates a different challenge for the character, and the character has to overcome them. And every time they overcome them, they gain in their ability, and they gain in their understanding of who they are. But one of the things that George Lucas did that made Star Wars stand out as not just a myth story, but one of the all-time great myth stories, is the great problem with myth stories when we go on this physical journey is typically a main opponent is never around, because the character is always on the move. So that's why they bring in Darth Vader. And we find out near the end that how does Darth Vader attack? We see him attack multiple times, preventing the hero from getting his goal. But I mentioned the other way that you do it is attack his great weakness. That's where the connection with Darth Vader as the father, the evil father, was so great, and why that's one of the great reveals in movie history. I am your father. But that attacks Luke's great weakness, because he's never had a father. He's went with his aunt and uncle, and now he's got to decide whether to follow in his father's footsteps to be this dark lord, or to follow in the ways of this modern knight, this space knight, and continue to fight for the good. And this is the classic thematic opposition that the story sets up. There's so many different ways to see why this is such a successful and important story. But those are some of the structural reasons on what is going on in that story that makes it so great.
That's cool. Yeah, it's funny I love when you explain this stuff and then you learn back and you go, oh, that's why that got me so much. And you just see, and it's hard because you don't want to distill this into a formula, but there are these sort of general, to quote the famous Captain Barbossa, they're more like guidelines, but they are, in between rules and guidelines. But that's so cool. And you see the thought that goes. So yeah, the stuff that we maybe take for granted is just, when you look back though and reflect on it, is very intentional and very which is like, oh, he killed Obi-Wan. It's like, oh wow, he killed the closest thing Lucas had to a father.
And imagine all of these things, which are clearly so connected and so intentional. Imagine trying to figure out Star Wars, the not just the first Star Wars film, but the trilogy, figure that out as you go. It's just absurd. There's no way you could do that.
Yeah, that's how you end up with Jar Jar Binks. But that's another.
Mistakes were made. He's not perfect.
What's an example of a film? Because I do love in your book too that there are maybe the closest thing we have to perfect stories, etc. But what's maybe an example of a movie that is still very successful and a great story, but not all stories are perfect, and still there are some maybe problems with it. You've mentioned a couple in the book, but is there one that kind of jumps out of mind that we could use as kind of a good lesson of a movie that hits a lot of things well, but in your mind kind of underwhelms in an area?
Geez, now I got to go through the encyclopedia, and I'm much more typical of thinking in terms of which movies, because almost all movies do something wrong, quote,
Right.
wrong. To me, it's much more insightful and inspiring to look at these scripts and films that are virtually perfect. Let me just give you some examples, and they may not be ones that you would normally think of. Big. Big is a perfect script in the fantasy form. The original Thomas Crown Affair, a perfect script.
Oh, I haven't seen that, and it varies differently from the Pierce Brosnan reboot, right?
A little bit, yes, it does. It does in very important ways, and the Pierce Brosnan reboot is very good.
Oh, I know. I love that ending is phenomenal, and
Yes.
I need to go watch that again. But I
But
know.
the original Thomas Crown Affair is so brilliant, and it is an example of a rare combination of genres. This is one of the things I talk about in the Anatomy of Genres book, which is one of the ways to be successful in today's storytelling world in any medium is mix genres that are not normally mixed. And there we have crime plus love story, or more specifically, heist story plus a love story. But it's a brilliant script. And if you talk about a great ending, that thing is just will blow your mind. The Usual Suspects, brilliant script. You write something like that, and you are on the Mount Olympus of storytelling for the rest of your life and beyond.
I know it's funny. One story I noticed you mentioned in your books over and over, probably because beyond the Godfather, which is obviously one of my favorites, but I think you mentioned Chinatown more than almost any. So is that just another example of one that's just so amazing, so good? That's just like one of those near perfect ones for you?
It is, but I don't write it as high as I rate some of the other ones.
Okay.
Chinatown is, because Robert Towne is one of the, certainly in the top 10 of the greatest screenwriters ever, maybe the top 5, had an enormous influence on other screenwriters. And by the way, did a final rewrite of the first Godfather. And if you've ever seen the script of The Godfather before he did his rewrite, it was a brilliant script then. And somehow this guy took it to another level.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
Yeah. This guy was really good. I talk in the Anatomy of Genres book about it's essential that you hit the genre beats of the primary form that you're writing. But that's only half the battle. The other part of the battle is you have to transcend those beats, because just hitting the beats gets you in the ballpark with everybody else writing that form. In the case of Chinatown, a detective story. But to stand out from the crowd, to be part of that 1%, you've got to take that basic genre and transcend it, meaning you have to do it in a way that we have never seen before. And that means a lot of things. It may mean you execute the beats in a way that we haven't seen those beats executed. It might be you change the order of the beats, the way those beats are normally laid out in that form. But most importantly, it means taking, every genre has its own life philosophy that it is expressing through the theme. And this is the trick that almost no writers know about.
And I'm curious, are audiences is it both ways, that are we just more sophisticated today? I noticed that like it seems to get harder and harder in like simple movies. Like we need more plot beats. We need more reveals. Like M. Night Shyamalan ruined it for us. I'm always looking for an ending. I always applaud Jake Gyllenhaal's new series. I don't know if you saw Presumed Innocent. They did a fantastic. it's very rare that you can misdirect me so much.
Yeah.
And or the original Homeland, when that came out, if you remember, I was just
Yep.
like,
Yep.
that was amazing. So it's getting so hard. I feel bad for the writers because it feels like the audience is getting a little more expectant. Is that something you would
You've
concur with?
absolutely put your finger on the big problem. The reason that plot, the ability to construct complex plot, is what separates the top 1% from everybody else, is that the reader, the viewer, has seen so many stories, so many movies, they've seen every trick in the book. And so how do you top that? How do you surprise them with something they've never seen before? And this ties in with a trend, what I consider the most important trend in storytelling over the last 20 years in every medium, which is that stories, the requirement of stories to become more plot dense. And what are they doing? They're basically saying, the studios are saying, we need to give viewers 2 for the price of 1. We need to get more plot beats in the same 2 hours. And this is why one of the reasons why I talk so much in the Anatomy of Genres about mixing genres, because as soon as you mix genres, 2 or 3 genres, you go from a single genre, which has 15 to 20 beats, and you then go to 30 to 45 beats in the same 2-hour period. The plot density is fantastic. And also the surprise factor for the viewer is fantastic. It sounds easy to say. The problem is, how do you execute that? And for those writers who understand the importance of mixing genres, that's one thing, that's great. But knowing how to do it without getting story chaos is another matter.
Could you maybe, just because you're so good at this, and one of the best part of the book is you do open up, like, I love the chapter on horror and opening up with that and calling this a religious form of, this is about life and surviving. And then you also offer these great suggestions of how to turn it on its head and provide these examples of movies that, bend it a little bit. But, and then you look back and you go, all these movies that I've loved recently are these hybrids that, to try, and you're like, oh, it's actually really interesting. Is there one just top of mind that you think's a great example that maybe it would be a fun way to show some of the beats being inverted or mixed and blended as far as a fusion of 2 genres?
I'm not sure how many of your listeners are that familiar with this movie, but one of the best horror stories of many years is Ex Machina. And I talk about that in the horror chapter, which one of the things I talk about with horror is it's the most underestimated of all the genres. It's typically looked down on. It's a slasher movie, right? Yeah, if you do it as a slasher movie, it's just a slasher movie. But horror, if combined with, especially if combined with myth or combined with science fiction, is one of the greatest of all forms. And it's one of the most philosophical of all forms with massive power. And of course, it all started with Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is one of the most important stories in the history of story. It basically started the modern horror story. It wasn't the first horror story, but it was the first modern horror story. And it started the science fiction form. And it's a combination of the two. Ex Machina is a similar example of that. And what the beauty of it is, horror tends to be very much low level. We have a monster who is attacking relentlessly, and that's why it can be such a low level story and very reactive story. The hero is just reacting to the opponent attacks. And that creates all kinds of problems. First of all, we always want an active hero. We don't want a reactive hero. But also we get this problem of there's very little plot in a typical horror story because it's hitting the same beat, which is one of the biggest sins of horror. Hitting the biggest sense of story. But where you see it a lot in is the basic horror story, which is, first of all, the monster kills this person this way, then they kill somebody else that way, and then they kill somebody else. It's the same beat with just slightly different skin. So when you combine it with science fiction, which is one of the biggest of all genres, science fiction has been referred to as social philosophy in fiction form. You get the incredible fear and emotional power of horror, and you get the heady, intellectual, societal vision that you get from science fiction. So the beauty of combining something like Ex Machina, which on a very small scale, it basically takes place in this house. And yet it has tremendous power in terms of what is a human being. In that sense, it's very much like what's the film that combines horror with and science fiction with detective, Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Yes. And 2001. All of those are using the science fiction combined with horror to get into the question is what is human? And the answers they come up with are very different than what we normally think. And this is one way that you're taking a basic genre like horror and expanding its thematic scope so that its power to the audience is much bigger, exponentially larger.
Is Alien a great example of that, where you have, I mean, obviously it's a horror masterpiece, but when you put it against the backdrop of this sort of company and they're actually manipulating this team and at the forfeiting of their lives, and you have this backstory of this kind of, you do pick up on this really dystopian society while you have this fundamental fight to stay alive. Is that an example of that kind of fusion?
It's a perfect example of it. And again, what you're always looking for in a horror is a haunted house. And this is a haunted house that flies through space. But the compression that you get, really, horror is about putting the hero in a box and having that box get progressively smaller and tighter and more dangerous. And Alien is an absolutely perfect example. As close to a perfect script as there is.
Oh, and that ending, it just, I always wish I could be, my mom said she saw Alien. She's like, I've never been more frightened in my life. And especially the third part, not to say third act, but just you talk about managing audience expectations. I mean, and then just visually, you're like, this is the most disturbing.
No, it's one of those great moments I think, in movie history that is everybody remembers that moment and the shock of it. And that is, to give you a perfect example, that is the power of a reveal. That is a classic reveal. And it is so shocking to not only the characters there, but to the audience, that it just kicks the movie up to a whole other level, and a whole another level of terror that just keeps getting more and more intense. And talking about the tornado effect, Alien is a good example of the tornado effect as you can get. The amount of hits that happen in the last 5 minutes it's just overwhelming.
Oh, it's phenomenal. It's interesting. When we think about genre, it seems like this is the general sort of area that you occupy. But, going back to, for example, like The Godfather, I think, and do these beats that accompany like love stories, for example, because I think of The Godfather and you've got a love story between Michael and Kay. I think about the famous hospital scene and the compression and the horror that comes of there. I think of there's some crime beats of when we have to move you in Italy because there's people after your life. Is that an example where they're borrowing all these beats, and then I guess based on, you have enough beats that kind of cement you in this genre, but are those examples of kind of borrowing beats from horror and love story, et cetera, that kind of help make that such an amazing story?
It's a good question. It brings up a very important distinction for writers to understand if they want to create something at that level, which is there's a difference between combining genres and grabbing genre techniques from a particular genre to use in a particular scene. You mentioned the hospital scene. That is written totally as a horror scene. It's got every trick in horror in that one scene. But the overall story is not a mixture of gangster and horror, for example. Now, and there's a number of these crime elements. That's because gangster is a part of the, quote, crime family. It is a kind of crime story, but it's got very specific crime elements, which is why we call it a distinct genre from the crime form, which is distinct from another genre in that family, detective. I think one of the keys to The Godfather, and I give total credit to the original writer of the book. I like to think, Coppola did this film and blah, blah, blah.
No, the books, I was shocked at how many lines in the movie are straight out of the book.
And for me, even more important is the underlying structure of that book is all there from the film. And they're combining the gangster genre with fairy tale techniques and family drama. And For example, fairy tale, one of the most important of all fairy tale techniques is the three brothers or the three sisters, like the three little pigs. Basically, you get the oldest tries with the oldest has these abilities and fails. The second one has different abilities, they fail. It's only the third brother that has the right combination of abilities to succeed. And that's exactly how the Godfather works. Sonny is all force. That's not going to cut it. Fredo is not even in the picture, so the next guy, the other second brother really is Tom, even though he's the adopted son. He's all about talk. He's all about making deals. And then the third guy who combines deals, thinking with force is Michael, and that's the right combination. There's so many things going on in that Godfather story that are why it's so great. I consider one of the 10 greatest films ever made, and so worthy of study if you want to learn to be a great storyteller.
And top it off with performances that just, I mean, you can't take your eyes off. I mean, it's just Marlon Brando. And then to make the second one, there's a look that Michael Corleone gives Kay when he finds out, or when she tries to come back and visit him, and Pacino could just like destroy your soul. That stare is just, it's such a masterpiece. I love it. So basically, one of the things I love about your book is you could look up, if you have a scene like the hospital scene, which is, it's just always one of my favorites. And the music, the footsteps down the hall, you could go to Anatomy of Genre and you could pull open the horror section and you could say, what are some of these, principles and beats from horror? And it's like, it's compression, it's a haunted house. And it's like, and then I could go to my scene and say, I've got Vito Corleone in an isolated area. Everyone's gone home. Right now I'm outnumbered, right? It seems like you could borrow those and use your book and the principles to do that.
Exactly what you want to do. It's exactly what you want to do. I always tell writers, whatever you can borrow, if it will make that scene work and make the overall structure work, borrow it. That's what it's there for.
Why do you think, I wonder sometimes about some of these shows, like let's take Ted Lasso and Yellowstone, for example. Do you think Ted Lasso is sort of a fusion of like comedy, and it's a little bit of sports, and it's also like there's a little bit of a love story there, but also it comes out in a time when America is at home and quarantined. And I think about Yellowstone and the Western, and did that launch at just the right time where people, or it was already in production, but where people are just like salivating over Utah and all this stuff. But I'm curious about, maybe we can start Yellowstone. Like, is it just it's done so well, or what is going on with this Western moment we're in that Taylor Sheridan has been such an important part of? I just feel like I'm seeing Western everywhere, studios wanting Western stuff. And is it surprise you at all that dominated kind of the zeitgeist recently?
One of the things I talk about in Anatomy of Genres in the chapter on Western, which is one of my two favorite of all the chapters, is that the classic Western disappeared many years ago. But it didn't die completely. It transformed itself and worked through other genres. So where you normally see the Western is in stories like Star Wars, which is fantasy and science fiction. But especially you see it in science fiction, the science fiction Western. Why? Because it's only by going in space that we can recreate the story world that is required for a Western to exist, which is it's got to happen on the wilderness. We live in a world where there virtually is no wilderness now. It's gone. And it's been gone. Just famous, and I talk about this in the chapter on Western. Since 1890, the census came out and said the wilderness is gone. It's over. And that fundamentally changed the nature of American culture, because we went from this, we sing ourselves as Westerners, as these cowboys going west and fighting and taming the wilderness. And all of a sudden we're living in the city. And that's detective world. That's crime world. And so but you've got a great form. The Western is a fabulous form. It's one of the all-time great forms. So what do? You have to take it into space. Now, the other way you do it is you do a modern Western, an anti-Western, or you create a situation where, either by going back in time to 1883, for example, but you go back to a world where the actions of the individual cowboy and the strong leader and this guy who's basically creating an empire out of nothing, the classic American dream, where that can happen again. And for about 120 years, from about 1840 to 1960, the Western was the most popular of all American stories. And it was because it was our creation myth. It was the story we wanted to tell about ourselves. And then finally, reality got so overwhelming, that's not who we were anymore, that we had to leave it. So this is all part of this nostalgia for, geez, I'd sure to get back to the old, quote, the old days, which of course nobody today has ever even seen, but to get into that world where we can, again, it's all about the deeper theme. And that deeper theme is, that's who I wish we were, and that's who I wish I could be now.
Yeah, and I think too, even Ted Lasso, he's a little bit of a cowboy, and they satire that American, like you're right, it's maybe there's a rediscovery of just our cultural, like of what some of the American identity is. And yeah, I just think it's really interesting. You know, also these things hit at the right time, and I marvel at Taylor Sheridan's output too. And I mean, he's just a great example of what you said, 1%, and he manages to surprise us. I mean, a character like Beth, I haven't seen that in a long time. So that's amazing. I do want to get a little bit, and I know we got to wrap up soon here, but I'd be remiss. I want to get a few more tips for writers. But before I get into that, with the advent of AI, one of the things I've always noticed with writers, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I always am not surprised when I do the interviews with the showrunners afterwards. You find out a lot of them were Ivy League, advanced degrees, literature, and it seems like, wow, you got to be really sharp, or it really helps to think sharp about like these people who are writing these incredible stories. But with AI, I'm curious to get your thoughts, because people can program these templates and you can feed it all these different inputs and say, map out story and plot. Do you see this as being, there's some ethical questions, of course, but like, how do you see AI affecting writing and plotting, given that we have this supercomputer that can now analyze this stuff that you have even like articulated and put together for everybody?
I consider AI the biggest existential threat for writers there is, and certainly in my lifetime. And that is because of the appearance that it gives us. And it gives us the sense that it's similar to what we were talking about earlier with 3-act structure. It gives us the appearance that we can just grab these templates from AI and we can write a good story. And I especially am very sensitive to this, because you go to the Authors Guild website, you can type in your book and see if it has been stolen from, and mine have. And my books are perfect for, quote, the AI approach, which says, okay, let's just grab these beats and then we'll just hit those beats and we'll be successful. The problem with it is that I believe that if you are a writer and you go that route, you have essentially made a deal with the devil. It will make you think that you're writing better. And this is the real danger, because for a large percent of writers using AI, they will write better.
Yeah, it can elevate someone. I mean, I thought about this.
Exactly.
If you were a D- writer and you said, hey, here's my story, reconcile this with Jon Truby's 22 steps and expose deficits in my writing, right? It could do that, right?
It will. Exactly. That is exactly what's going to happen. The problem is that you got to keep your eye on the prize. You got to keep your eye on the endpoint goal, which is, I want to get into that top 1%. I want to have a story brand that is unique to me. AI is by definition generic. It is the medium. It is the middle. All it is doing is repeating this basic pattern without any originality to it at all, without any of the twisting the beats, transcending the genre, any of that. And so what you're going to get is, you might be as good as 50% of writers, the lower 50%, but that's a long way from being in the top 1%. The only way to get to the top 1% is to learn the techniques that allow you to write a well-structured story on which you can then apply your original vision. Only you can provide. That's why they have to come to you and pay you the big money. So don't fall for the illusion that AI is going to make me a better writer and I will get to my goal. You won't. It will guarantee that you don't get to your goal.
All right, to play devil's advocate, another great Pacino movie I enjoyed. Is there a world where you see AI helping top writers? For example, we know it can help in research, right? Well, it's funny, it still hallucinates like crazy. I always marvel that this thing that can generate 3D worlds will still make up just random quotes. It cannot, for whatever reason, get certain things right. Like, I asked it to give me some quotes from some Catholic saints the other day, and not only had it made up saints that didn't exist, they had some of the best quotes you've never heard from saints that never existed came from ChatGPT. I was experimenting, being like, is this, I was comparing it to Google. But is there a world where you see studios and everyone, I mean, we actually know some studios already investing in this, but where they use it to expose plot holes or try and say, like, if you have a great story, could AI be a tool, like just having another voice in the room to analyze plot holes or inconsistencies and things like that?
I don't see that happening because when we use terms like show me plot holes, it sounds like a very specific technical thing that something, if we were programmed with enough information, it could do. But no, what sets something apart as a unique story is not, does it hit the plot beats and with no plot holes? No, that is the minimum level to be a story at all. Now, keep in mind, again, when you talk about the studios, why would they invest in this? It's because the studios, when they get these scripts, they got to send it to a reader. And the reader, 99% of these scripts, 99.9% of these scripts are going to be turned down. They're not good enough for various reasons. So, yes, AI can do some of the grunt work for why that reader is saying this is going to be turned down. But that's not, the trick is how do we spot the 0.1% of scripts that we want to make, that we want to spend $200 million making and even more marketing? That's something that AI will never be able to do because it can't tell you, it can't show you the heights. It can only show you why it's in the depths.
I love what you said, yeah, because also, I imagine too, if you're a writer and you start depending on AI, right, then it's like you're also forfeiting that muscle that, driving on the freeway, like Sorkin says, and I'm meditating and ruminating. And the other part too is you have to be good enough at story to recognize if AI did spit out a good story, are you going to be good enough to recognize it?
It's absolutely right. That is my biggest fear for writers using AI, is because to get to that top 1%, you have got to exercise your skills, your story muscle, which can only be done by breaking story. That's why you need to talk to any showrunner. Almost all of their work for the entire staff is breaking the story. And this is a team of top professionals, and they have a massive amount of trouble trying to break these stories. If you are relying on AI to do this work, your ability to break story is never going to develop beyond the most minimal level.
That's good. Man, I know, because it is scary. Thankfully, because we do a lot of comedy commercials for our agency, and thankfully, what I have found AI to be interesting as an ideation partner to help sort through stuff, which has been like to kind of kickstart the brainstorming. I've had to accept that because we used to, clients would pay us a lot and we could do these amazing targeted ideation sessions and walk through. And now they can type in a prompt and they actually can insert commercials. And I had a client tell me they took one of our commercials and said, can you generate some ideas in the voice of this guy and his writing? And it spits out, and sometimes it does good ideas, which lead to good ideas, right? But you're right. Is it capable of injecting something that's like the human struggle? And I also wonder too, like when you're reading a story too, there's also the backstory of struggle, right? When I watch Titanic, I'm also experiencing James Cameron's decade of making that and building that. Am I going to want to see something that someone typed into I would hope as a human, I would know the difference if someone had just had a prompt and made it Like,
Yes.
I would hope my human faculties could be like, no, I don't know why I'm not resonating with this because this isn't human.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you pointed out a moment ago, the biggest problem, even with using it, as tempting as it is, even using it at the idea stage, is that it is a drug. It's, oh, that gave me some real help on the idea level. Maybe I'll try to use it for character too. And, oh, now maybe let's see what it can do for plot. And so it grabs more and more of the process, and which means you're farther and farther away from doing the hard work that is required for greatness. There is no shortcut to getting to greatness.
Amen. I want to finish with some just practical tips here. One, how about a note of encouragement? We live in a society too where we really prize the young. So and so is the 30 under 30. Young, especially in Hollywood, right? Young talent, because I'm not obviously catering to the movie stuff. But for those who are sitting around going, man, I'm 50 and I've always had this dream and I want to write, and it's just impossible. And if you're not work for that long, but any encouragement for those who have been simmering on a story and think that the opportunity has passed them by?
The great thing about being a writer instead of being versus being an actor is because it's on the page. The page doesn't care how old you are, what color you are, what your nationality is, etc., etc. If it's on the page, it will be recognized. I think one of the great misconceptions that people have is, oh, it's all about who, right? If I just knew the right people, I'd get the work. It's actually the opposite. The work gets you the right people. It is all about the work. Work on your skills. Work on your story techniques. And that means you got to write a lot. You've got to break a lot of different stories. You can't just work on one for 10 years. You've got to get that story muscle so it is absolutely honed. But if you do that work, then and you are able to translate it onto the page, it will take off. They will want it so badly that you will have people competing for it. So don't worry about what your age is. Just get greatness on the page. Now, easier said than done, I know. But the point is, nobody is going to turn it down because, oh, you're 50 years old and we don't really want to do a 50-year-old guy script.
I love it. And I imagine too, in a world of potentially AI fueled above average mediocrity, perhaps like the gold will shine even brighter.
For sure. For sure.
That's great.
There's no question about it.
As far as we talked about plotting a lot, and that's one of the big weaknesses, but weaknesses is, so generally speaking, for writers right now who maybe want to level up and get that 80-20 gain in their writing, etc., what would be your practical step? Would it be obviously grab a copy of Anatomy of Story, Anatomy of Genre, and then would it be, hey, as tempting and fun as it is to want to jump into the dialogue and the scenes and get so excited, like have the restraint, take the time, and actually plot out your story and really invest more in that kind of foundation?
Yeah. One of the great misunderstandings in storytelling is the idea, and I used to push this myself for many years until I realized how dangerous it is. It is the suggestion that just get it on paper. Just write that first draft, get it out there so you don't get blocked, get past your critical self and so on. Biggest mistake you could make. If you don't do your prep work, what you get on paper will not only be bad, your ability to fix it disappears. Why? Because as soon as you take it from here to the page, it hardens into cement. And the ability to fix it becomes much more difficult. Why? Because the trick to improving a script and actually making it a great script is get the structural elements right first. That's the real prep work. If you do that prep work up front, I guarantee you it will save you 10 times the work down the road, and it will be 10 times better. You've got to do your prep work up front of both character and plot. If you do that, every rewrite will improve it, because you just keep fixing the structure, making it a little bit better, intensifying that punch, counter punch, all those things that we talked about. It just moves you toward greatness instead of this very depressing experience of, I just did a draft and it's worse than what I started with. Why am I writing at all?
John, can I ask you, this is a strange question. I'm sure you get asked this, but like when you become the story expert and the analyst, is there more pressure on yourself to say, why am I not cranking out 9 Godfathers, 4 Chinatowns, 3, like constantly, like just studying, does one take away from the other? I'm curious if that's ever been like something you've had to wrestle with, like, whoa, I know I've mastered the plot points, right? I should be like constantly, and whether you want to or not is a separate question, but I'm curious if that's something you ever go through as a thought process.
I made a decision many years ago as I was trying to improve my story skills of what is the best way to apply these skills to the business itself. One of the things I really emphasize to writers is don't just write, have some sense of the business of story, because that will focus what you do. So many years ago, I realized I can do the typical Hollywood approach, which is write a spec script, try to sell it. And what does that get for most 99.9% of writers, even if it's a good script? It's sitting on your shelf doing nothing. Nothing. Because the chance of selling that script as a spec script is between 0 and none. Now, does it happen? Yes, but not even as much as it used to 20, 30 years ago. So I thought the way to do it is get a reputation within the inside, get hired to write instead of me knocking on their door, have them knock on my door. So get known for your story skills, get paid for what you do, and have a 100% rate of payment for work as opposed to a 0.001% of getting paid for work. This is also why I tell writers now, and have for many years now, if you have a great story idea, write it first as a novel. You have a 100% chance of getting it published. 100% chance. You have a 0.001% chance of getting a spec script bought and made.
So just to push back a little, sir, when you said earlier, like the work speaks for itself, it'll scream, it'll find out, like focus on just making the gold. Was that more in the context of that'll get you the right people? And you're talking about just the actual economic side of it. Like if you have a great script, it'll get you the right rep, but it won't get you the sale.
Exactly. It's not necessarily going to sell. It probably won't sell. Same is true in television. You write a spec script or of a show that's on TV, you're not going to sell it to that show. But what it is a calling card. The real trick is to get inside the gates. These various things that you have got to be in the inside, even to be able to show your skills. It's one thing to have the skills, another thing to get them on paper, but it's yet another thing to be able to get that recognized and to be part of the inner workings of this machine that is so complicated and for most of it is behind closed doors.
It's been wonderful. Obviously, people need to go check out Anatomy of Story, Anatomy of Genre. I imagine anyone who's a writer probably heard of it. That's a testament to the success. But is there any other place you'd love to send folks? Any courses or classes or resources that you would love to mention?
If anybody's interested in my story software that is designed for writing a great story in any medium and in any genre, or in getting some of my story courses, you can just go to truby.com, truby.com.
Awesome. All right, truby.com. You can find it. John, what a treasure. I could talk to you for hours, but I think we've reached Act 3. We went long, just like any good story, but third act, and enjoyed the punch, counter punch, and we got to the end there. So thank you so much for all you've done and for helping writers. And everyone please check out Anatomy of Story and Anatomy of Genre. Anatomy of Genre is fantastic. They're both amazing, but it's so cool to see it broken down. So
thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking story with you. I love your questions, and I love sharing story knowledge with you, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Absolutely. Well, in the words of Don Corleone, I will say, I want to thank you, Jon Truby, for being with us today, and may your next story be a successful one. So, buona sera, buona sera.